So before we proceed, let's extend a warm welcome to Mr. Kaprangi. Thank you, Mr. Kaprangi, for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Jimmy.
Anticipate your presentation via Zoom. The floor is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jimmy, for the warm welcome. Can you all hear me clearly? Is that better?
Yep, we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right, apologies for that. All right, again, once again, thank you. Sorry, technology sometimes it's not perfect. So can you be able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, I might be asking in between just in case I end up talking and the screen doesn't show. But again, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the warm welcome from Mr. Cox. I appreciate it. As he mentioned, there's a bit of background. I was in Divinewood from 2004 to 2007. I did my bachelor's degree there. And right after that, I started my career doing accounting with a company called the Consort Express Lines. So I started in shipping, and for about almost 2 years, did a bit of accounting in shipping, accounts payable, receivable, and a bit of general accounting. But that was when my career changed, and I stepped into the internal audit field. So I left Consort to go to Coca-Cola. So I was there briefly for just less than a year. Then I actually started as a assistant audit officer. So that's basically how my career started in internal audit. And like I always tell my fellow colleagues and students who have come across and young graduates that, they don't teach you this in uni. You probably will be familiar with external audit, but internal audit it's quite similar, has a similar principles around it, but there are a few differences I'll probably explain in one of my slides. And I think this presentation shouldn't take more than an hour unless there's a lot of Q&A. Happy to take any questions at the end of it. So during my presentation, so as you can see at the bottom, so as Mr. Cox mentioned, I'm currently a treasurer for the Institute of Internal Auditors. And I'll explain what the Institute of Internal Auditors is in the next slide. So, which will basically cover what internal audit looks like in PNG, the background, and what is internal auditing, as I suspect that you would not be familiar with, but I'm happy to share some links and slides later on after this presentation. Who are internal auditors? What are the key skills and responsibilities that you need in this profession? Also, the role of internal audit in the enterprise risk management. I'll share a bit on what is enterprise risk management and what it looks like for role as an internal audit. And I'll also share a short video of the institute which we work closely with in Australia, and one of the former CEO do a short video which I think is relevant for the presentation as well. So basically, internal audit in Papua New Guinea. Well, as you know, internal audit or the Institute of Internal Auditors in Papua New Guinea is a professional membership organization. So I currently wear two hats. I have a full-time job, but I also do part-time volunteering. As part of the institute, it's kind of like, I think you're more familiar with CPA. CPA PNG, they have an office where they provide support for training and development for accountants. Well, Institute of Internal Auditors is pretty much the same. It's a young organization, but I won't dwell too much about it. But just to give you a snapshot, the practice here in Papua New Guinea, it's affiliated with the Global Institute that's based in the USA, and it operates under what we call global standards and practice that provides guidance for the profession. So currently, I think one of the objectives is to serve professional organization and provide support here in Papua New Guinea. So I think that's something that I've been a part of. I'm currently his treasurer, and being treasurer, we promote development and advocating the profession here around Papua New Guinea. So just to give you a bit of background, for those, this is just a brief history about the Institute of Internal Auditors, PNG. So I'll use a few acronyms. Please mind you, IAA means Institute of Internal Auditors. So this basically began in 2000. I probably was still in high school then. And I think it took a while when they began talks and forming the institute. And then in 2003, the chapter members or the founding members organized a 2-day seminar with 40 participants with a guy named Bill Anderson. Bill Anderson, he's a long-standing member of IAA Australia. So we get a lot of support also in terms of professional training with the Institute of Australia. This has begun back then in, when I said 2004, that was when I did my first year at Divine. So these board members met, they formed a committee and submitted the application to the IAA board in the USA to recognize Papua New Guinea as an organization. So when they recognized Papua New Guinea wanted to create like a CPA PNG, but its own very institute here in Papua New Guinea, so we can develop and promote the profession. Again, when AGM was held, they voted and they had proper elections to vote in new office bearers. And as you can see in the last point, I've noted a few names. Our first president his name was Bernard Kesako. So he's passed on already. There's a lady, she's also like a mentor to me. Her name is Daisy Bautista. She's originally from the Philippines, but has lived in Papua New Guinea most of her life. I think the first vice president was Oscar Nonop and Russell Tato. So out of these two first board members, I'd say Russell and Daisy are people who I still keep in contact with. And Mr. Russell Tato is currently the Chief Risk Officer for Kumu Consolidated Holdings. And I think Daisy was a former CFO with PNG Power. She's been around PNG, had several jobs in holding finance managerial positions and also providing internal audit advisory. So I know I'm going to slide through just a few theoretical concepts on just to gauge your understanding of what internal audit is. So what is it? Auditing is, people say that sometimes you're the watchdog or you're the policeman. There used to be that old saying, because every time when an auditor comes into the room, people are always on their toes. But in internal auditing, it's more of a assurance, insight, and objective. So just to give you a bit of understanding, there are 3 different types of elements that sort of gives you that whole picture of what internal audit comprises of. When we talk about assurance, internal audit provides assurance. You provide comfort, you provide a good overall insight to the board and management team that things are operating under the policy and procedures of the organization. When you give insight, it talks more about So you're, like they say, you're the watchdog. You have access or unrestricted access compared to any other person in an organization. So you can be able to go and know what other staff, our other staff work or procedures that they're doing. Whereas if you're in some other functions, you don't have the right to go and ask them what they're doing and check their work and so on. So internal audit actually gives you unrestricted access and insight into everything that an organization does. So objectivity means that you must be objective in what you do, not subjective. So subjective is the opposite of objective. Subjective is when you have an opinion, or it's more of a personal opinion which is not backed up by evidence. So when you're being objective, you have to provide assurance or objective opinion that is backed by evidence or backed by principles and standards of why is it that you're doing what you're doing. So internal auditing is broadly encompasses three of those elements. So I just thought I'd try and simplify it in those terms. Apologies for any buzzwords, but you know, this is basically what we call the business language. When you leave university and when you come onto the field, these words will be normally used over and over again. So, you know, I encourage you to look into these words and understand what they mean. They sometimes would mean differently in other subject, but for the purposes of internal audit, I think this is just an overview of what it means. So I think this is important. For all of you that are here today, tonight, I know you've covered audit from an external point of view. So I think this compares what internal and external auditors do. So typically, as you can see in this table, external auditors is mainly people who are hired by an organization to come into the organization to provide a specific service. For example, doing the annual audit review. Okay, internal auditors, they are actually employed by the organization. See, that's a very big difference. So when you're employed by the organization, you actually work for the organization. But I'll explain why it's different. Internal audit has to be objective, as I mentioned previously. So there's things that they must comply with in terms of code of conduct. They must be independent of the activities that they do. So in most cases, internal auditors, when they sit in an organizational structure, the manager or the head of the internal audit does not report to the CEO, maybe administratively, for example, to approve transportation or travel or things like that. But when you're talking about the function and the audits and the reports that they produce, it goes straight to what we call the audit and risk committee. So I won't dwell too much on that, but that's just to give you an understanding. So when you look at who are internal auditors, a more broad focus, as you can see, they talk about risk management. So what I currently do, in my current role, I manage risk and compliance for the super fund, number one super. And risk management basically means that we work closely with internal audit, but we work for the organization in providing assurance to management that the risks are being minimized. So we also provide a function similar to internal audit, but not so much. We don't go and check other organizations' policies and procedures. We only look at what are those key risk areas, and we only communicate and we liaise a lot with the management team in understanding that what are those risks that we've identified in an organization are being managed appropriately. So corporate governance, again, These are all buzzwords, which I hope, some after this, you can go and look it up. So risk management is also a focus where internal audit looks into. Corporate governance is more around the frameworks, the policies, the procedures. Are they in place in an organization? So the internal audit will go and ensure that the corporate governance function is, or the frameworks are working. There is documented policies and procedures. There is documented charters. Or the organization has a constitution if it's a registered entity. Are we following our tax requirements? Things like that. When you talk about organizational objectives, again, quite a big broad word, but in simple terms, when an organization, why does the organization exist? One is to either make money, they produce goods or services. But when you drill down, why is the whole purpose? What is the core objective? So for example, just to give you an example of the Institute of Internal Auditors, PNG, our objective is to provide a professional, ensure the profession is being supported here locally here in Papua New Guinea. So every organization has an objective. So as internal auditors, you go and ensure that those objectives are being drilled down to each respective, for example, business units. And each business unit plays a key important role, and its objective is to function the way it functions in order to meet the organization needs. So internal audit sometimes look at what are those business objectives? Are they operating efficiently, effectively? Internal audit checks that are we complying with our laws or policies? Are the financial statements accurate? And many more. So mainly internal audit focus on internal process. Whereas when you look at external audit, it's more or less about financial statements. So the next table, as you can see, diverse background or skill sets. In one of the next slides, I'll talk about what are those key skills and responsibilities. But this is just, again, another snapshot of what are those diverse skills. For internal audit, again, one of the key skills that I've learned is, since I started, I think it was in 2009 with Coca-Cola. You have to be, when they talk about communication skills, you have to be able to communicate both verbally and on paper as well. There's now so many means of communications. You got to be good at using computers. So when you're using computers or smartphone technology or the different systems that we use in an organization or accounting systems, you got to be able to communicate any information that the company, both electronic and manual documentation as well. So when you talk about data mining and analytics, you got to have analytical skills. As an internal auditor, remember that your primary responsibility while working within the organization, you'll have access to information. You'll get reports, and based on those reports, you could probably export them into Excel, and then you can be able to run dashboards or create pie graphs and things like that. Business industry and specific knowledge. In my background, again, I've worked in a few industries. As I mentioned, the shipping industry, I started with the shipping industry, then I moved on to manufacturing or fast moving goods, fast consumer goods industry. So that's mainly around, for example, food manufacturing or soft drinks, Coca-Cola, SP Brewery. I'll share a bit of my CV online just so you know the career that's taken me where I am today, just to give you an idea on how you can build your career after leaving the environment. So primarily, as you can see, I won't dwell too much. Looking at its primary focus as an external auditor is more or less around accounting the primary accounting background and skills, which is probably most of you seated in this room, I believe, or maybe you can correct me there, Mr. Cox. So with external audit, it's more backward looking. So backward looking is, you may have been taught this, because you mainly look at what are those financial results, and then you work backwards towards looking at the source documents and the processes and systems. Whereas internal auditors, while it's backward looking, it's also forward looking. So as I mentioned, you work for this organization, and at the same time, you have to be independent. And when you're looking at documentations, you also have to look at where does the organization want to be in 5 years' time. And then since you're part of the organization, you got to make sure that all the process objectives, all the systems that are working in order to meet your organization strategy or your goals. So I've talked a bit more about this in previous slide, but so as students of Divine Med, I know you've gone through, I'm not sure if you're all in your final year or some in your third year. So you would have done subjects such as business communication, if I can recall, accounting, all these other courses and subjects. But there's one thing that you have to know, that in internal audit profession, there's a lot of soft skills that you have to also do. So I'll give you an example. While I was Divine Med, I did attend what we call the Toastmasters. I don't know if it's still there, Divine Med. You know, Toastmasters is a really good skill. It enables you to think on your feet. You're given a topic and you'll be able to structure your presentation within the short period of time. So those are some of those skills that I wanted to talk about. And as you can see here in number 3, communication skills is a key skill. You know, talking is not just talking, listening is also very important. So when you're doing internal audit, you actually go and you sit with management and you ask about the process and systems. And that's when you have to really listen and understand those processes and systems in order to develop what we call an audit plan or internal audit plan. So that's where the communications plays a really vital skill in this. Also, attention to detail. You know, when listening and writing, you have to pay attention to any key details that you come across. I've already mentioned about analytical skills. Integrity. I know integrity is quite a broad word, but you know, you have to be honest about what you're doing. I understand you have done a course, it's called business ethics. That's sort of where one of those values or the key skills, it's related towards ethics, business ethics, where integrity in the profession, you have to be able to report facts and figures. Time management is very important. In internal audit, similar to external audit, you're given a short period or you're given a project timeline, and during those timeline, you have to do your planning, you have to do your field work, and then your reporting. So all of those activities in internal audit, time management is very important. Adaptability, you have to be able to adapt to different processes and systems or different industries. Mr. Cox and we used to work for PwC several years back now, prior to him joining Divine Med. So that's something that we learned when we were in an accounting firm, is you're going to walk into different industries. So you have to be able to adapt to the different changes, different environments. So that's a skill. Again, as I mentioned, these are just soft skills on top of what you've already learned at Divine Med, with the subjects that you should also combine some of these skills. So I'm not going to go too much, but that's just a list. I'll share this slide later on, and maybe at your own time, you can look them up, because a lot of these soft skills do help you to build your career as well. I've talked about responsibilities in brief in the previous slides, but as a process in internal audit, I'd say what we call the three-phase process. Phase one is all about planning. So during the planning phase, there's usually a lot of communication, a lot of attention to detail, a lot of analytics, because you're able to understand what you're going to audit in terms of once you get the information, you have to only pick samples. I won't dwell too much. There's quite a lot of technical information around this, but I'm just touching the surface on this. Well, when you do come out in the field, as I explained, most of these skills and responsibility you learn it on the job. During uni, I think you'll only touch on the theoretical aspects of it. So these are some responsibilities when we talk about evaluating risks. So internal audit depends a lot on risk information. So currently what I do for number one super in risk, based on the risk that I assess with management, I provide that risk information back to our internal audit team. I ensure some of the controls, meaning, for example, there's processes. You have a documentation. Is the document signed? Does the document have a receipt? You know, in any what we call a control document, there needs to be supporting evidence or supporting receipts. You know, you don't just go and you pay your school fee and then say that you've already paid it. You bringing your receipt where you deposited at the bank back to the school, that's evidence. You have to provide it to the bursar, and then they confirm and reconcile, and that in itself is what we call a control, making sure that school fees are being paid. So with all these processes, as internal auditors, a key responsibility in any organization is you're all about improving process. There's always a beginning and end of a process, and in between there are so many different activities. And it's, in my experience, normally the saying goes, we don't live in a perfect world, and it's so true. So there's always things happening. There's always times when people will do something wrong. Human error is a risk in any organization. So, you know, when there's a lot of moving parts, sometimes things go missing. So you as an internal auditor, you ensure that processes are being followed, systems are working, documentations are complete. And when there's gaps in the process, that's where internal audit can be able to provide recommendations to improve the process. So again, number 5, when we talk about responsibilities, internal audit, key responsibilities to review process and procedures. You monitor compliance. Investigate fraud is another key area or responsibility. Some organizations, they actually have what we call investigation officers. But you also play a role in some processes in the organization where you're part of an investigation to find out why did the fraud occur. So these are just the top 10, I'll say, skills and responsibilities as an internal auditor. So you assure safeguards, you promote ethics. I know you've all studied business ethics, so you understand those values. And last but not least, as internal auditors, you have to communicate results. And you communicate results with integrity. So as I mentioned, it's a key skill that the information is factual and there are no mistakes along the way. So I think this is an important one, just to give you a snapshot, everyone in the auditorium. So as a career part of internal audit, I've actually highlighted some top internal audit career paths. I think this might interest you. So as a young graduate, when you do come out in the field, a key pathway would be you can come on as what we call an assistant in audit or assistant internal auditor. Well, in my example, I started at Coca-Cola as an assistant audit officer. Titles vary, but it's pretty much the same. You'll have many organizations. I think in government departments, they call them something else. I think they call them internal audit officers. And from internal audit officers, you become internal auditor, and then you become senior, so forth. Some organizations, they say internal audit, or they call them analysts. Their name varies, but I think as a standard approach, I've only captured in some of the slides. But just to show you the top internal audit career paths from as an assistant internal auditor or audit officer, when you start off as a graduate, you might go into what we call a graduate program. And then at the end of your graduate program, you could probably be placed into an assistant internal auditor role. But as times go by, you grow into quite senior parts or roles, which from an internal auditor, you become what we call a senior internal auditor, or sometimes it can be an internal audit manager role. There are also career paths where, because again, one of those soft skills, as I mentioned, become a business analyst, because you do a lot of analytical reviews. So those are the skills that you can build and become, be placed into a role in that. Also risk analyst. So as I mentioned, the internal audit role touch on what we call risk. You understand the risk of an organization. There's also, it's a separate function of its own, for example, which I'm currently doing. But that's after, from years of experience, you can be placed in what we call operational risk management, where you look at more around the processes and controls and the risks of the organization and try to mitigate those risks by working with management and ensuring that the risks are minimized and being monitored. Another key one is a career path in internal audit. When you do start off in internal audit, you can also move into what we call compliance officers. So compliance officers, mainly you can find them in highly regulated organizations, such as banks, industries where there's a lot of government regulation. So you can start off as a compliance officer to a senior or a compliance manager. Again, the internal audit path can be able to build your profession into some of these roles. Okay, this was an interesting one. I know there's an IT course at DivineWed as well. If you're an IT person that's currently in this room, mind you, this is an upcoming role as well. We're all especially in what we call I think in the top employers, I've listed it down. In financial services industry, IT auditors are becoming common. And basically that means that you can be able to go in as an IT audit officer, or you can start off as an IT officer and then generally move into the internal audit department, and in the internal audit department has IT auditors as well. And as an IT auditor, you can also build your career into an IT audit manager role. So most of these top internal audit career paths, this is again based on my experience. And I've been working for about close to 15 years now. And I've took a gap year to do my studies, I think in 2016 to 2018. As Mr. Cox mentioned, I took a gap year to do some studies down in Australia. But collectively, I'd say I've worked for, more than 15 years now, going towards since 2007. And based on my experience, this is what I've seen in the industry. We've got some of the top internal audit employers, financial services industry. And I'll tell you the example why. Because of regulation from the central bank, when you have highly regulated institutions, they impart or they enforce those regulations into these organizations, and internal audit is one of those functions. So you've got banks like PSP, TISA is becoming a bank, just for information. Kina Bank, Westpac, a lot of those big, I think Credit Corp as well. Big organizations have internal audit roles. So I also have a bit of experience in the fast-moving consumer goods industry. So again, I used to work for SP Brewery, Coca-Cola, and again, Paradise. These organizations have internal audit roles in them as well. And if most of the companies or employees that I've mentioned, they're all in private sector. But I know if some of you do ever get work from government departments, it's mandatory, I think, under the Public Finance Management Act to have internal audit roles in each government department. So there is internal audit and also compliance divisions in a lot of our government departments. And this role can be also found in there. So just to give you a snapshot, I think if you can see at the bottom, again, this is only my best knowledge on what the industry best practice is currently paying. When you do finish when you do graduate, as an entry-level internal audit officer, you could be earning between 30 to 50,000 per annum. So this is just entry level. Minimum could be 30, and then you work your way up. From there, you can after, so junior level is usually 1 to 3 years. So if you do move up the ranks, you can move up to what we call a senior audit officer or senior internal audit officer. Sometimes you could be earning between 60,000 to 90,000 K per annum. A lot of managers now are earning over 100,000 to 150,000. The heads of internal audit, most heads of internal audit are ranging 150,000 plus. And again, if you're an executive or a group internal audit manager, most of those executive roles are already on 250,000 plus. So this is just to give you an idea of, if you do begin your career in internal audit, this could potentially what you could be earning if you say start off as a junior and finish off as a GM or a head or group internal audit manager. So this is just, again, based on my professional judgment. Don't quote me on this. This is just my opinion. Again, through close consultation and some research that I do, and also just talking to some of my colleagues and recruiters, this is currently what the market is paying for this career. I know I've been talking too much, but I'll maybe give you 1 minute. Maybe someone in the audience might have a question.